Welcome to this new moment of reflection and exchange here at the Commons. I'm standing at the very core of library archives in our monumental library events room, where in a few minutes we will host a discussion on our common agenda, a report by the Secretary General trying to give direction and vision to the work of member states and the international community at large to redesign the multilateral system. The Commons has been designed by us here at the library in UN Geneva as a space for reflecting, learning together, and especially equipping international staffers and diplomats with the best to allow them to do their jobs better. So, why multilateralism? Why now? Well, multilateralism has been in evolution since the very beginning, and before its organized system with the League of Nations in the 20s of last century, it was operating already in a setting that didn't have an international organization. Since then, we have created two universal global organizations, and yet multilateralism is considered to be under pressure these days and years. Is it really? It appears from research and academic reflections that multilateralism is still the only way to go if we have to solve problems together as nations, communities, and people. So why would it be under pressure? So for many, multilateralism is the system we have and the system that we will have in the future, except it's being designed for the challenges that were the major challenges of our times when the United Nations were created, right after the Second World War. Time has moved on. Challenges have become global. And today, it is more true than ever that not a single state, not an alliance of states, can begin to tackle these global problems in isolation. And this is where our common agenda comes in. The Secretary General report suggests a vision and a way forward for member states to consider how to refocus and redesign the multilateral system. Multilateralism is not just a diplomatic practice, it is a set of values. There is a number of principles embedded in this practice. It's a moral code of conduct for nation states. So what's in the report? We will discover this during this event today, thanks to Michelle Griffin, who is head of policy in the Office of the Secretary General. You will hear more about our common agenda and why this is important and how member states and other communities who participate in the elaboration of the multilateral system, including international organizations, may get to grips with the fundamental challenge of adapting multilateralism to the challenges of our times. I hope you will enjoy this discussion and you will learn from it, and you will come back again to our events here at the Commons Library Archives, UN Geneva.
Hi, Michelle. How are you today?
Very well, thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. My name is Davide, and I work at the SDG Lab, which is a multi-stakeholder innovation space for the SDGs and long-term sustainability at the Office of the Director General at UN Geneva. And on behalf of the SDG Lab, the UN Library, and the whole UN Geneva family, I'm very thrilled to be here with you today to talk about our common agenda, the Summit of the Future, and how they connect to the 2030 Agenda and the legacy that they build beyond that and the future of multilateralism. So before diving into our conversation, I would like to ask you to present yourself, tell us who you are and what you do.
Sure, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. My name is Michelle Griffin. I'm the director of the Common Agenda team in the Office of the Secretary General in New York. I've been a policy director in the Office of the Secretary General for a couple of decades now. And so I've had a long kind of involvement in previous efforts to think about multilateralism and the future of global governance, including back in 2005, and now the Common Agenda and the Summit of the Future.
Cool. Thank you very much. I would say we can start. And I would like to start with a question. First of all, what is our common agenda, and how did it came about, and how does it connect to the efforts towards the 2030 Agenda and 17 SDGs?
Sure. Well, in its most kind of simple sense, our Common Agenda is a report that the Secretary General wrote in 2021 as a response to a request from member states in the context of the 75th anniversary of the UN, in the middle of the first year of COVID, where they asked him to present to them ideas on current and future challenges. And in that report, he calls for much greater solidarity and trust at all levels, between people and their governments, between countries, and also between generations. And he identifies the fact that the SDGs are very much off track, and of course they're even further off track now, and calls for some changes to how we do business at the global level so that we can get back on track to delivering all of the promises that have already been made, all of the commitments already made in the Paris Agreement, in Agenda 2030, but also to be ready for the new challenges that have emerged since 2015, some of which promise to be materially worse than anything we've faced before. And essentially, the report is a wake-up call, and it is a strong message that business as usual doesn't mean things will stay the same. We are in a very connected, complex world facing catastrophic risks, but also opportunities. Business as usual means things that will get worse. And so the report really tries to make some proposals for how to take a different course. It's called Our Common Agenda because everybody needs to own it. It's much more than a report. It's really an idea about how to restore trust and solidarity and international cooperation.
Amazing. Thank you very much. This is very insightful. And we know that your team is all hands on deck for a key milestone coming up in December 2024, the Summit of the Future. But we also have a key milestones coming in September 2023, the SDG Summit. Can you help us understanding how the two are connected and related to each other?
Absolutely. So fundamentally, the connection between the SDGs and the SDG Summit and our Common Agenda, as the Secretary General likes to say, is that the SDGs are the what. We all agree on the what. That is the vision of the world we want. It's what we're trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. The Common Agenda and the Summit of the Future are about the how. How do we get there? How are we doing business at the global level? Is it working? Is it delivering solutions for people? Is it achieving the SDGs? Is it also allowing us to address new challenges, new threats, and harness new opportunities in an equitable way? And the answer, of course, is no. So procedurally, the summit, 2023 is all about the SDG Summit. It's all about doing everything we can to deliver those promises and to get the SDGs back on track. The outcome of the SDG Summit, the declaration, will, in a sense, hand the baton to the Summit of the Future. So whatever ideas that member states want to embrace or push in the outcome of the SDG Summit that can then be taken up in the Summit of the Future, that's how we see it. So the one summit hands the torch to the next summit. And it's all part of a series of summits and a series of efforts and a much bigger set of global conversations about how do we get closer to the world that was set out in Agenda 2030, and how do we, address all of these new and longer standing risks? How do we harness all of these opportunities, and how do we do so in a way that leaves no one behind?
Thank you for clarifying. This is a question that is often asked also to our SDG Lab by different member states. So this was very helpful. And zooming into the Summit of the Future now, can you tell us how did it came about and what is it trying to achieve?
Right. So the summit was proposed in the Common Agenda report. And it was proposed by the Secretary General precisely because the diagnosis of the report was that some of the reasons we are not delivering the SDGs and not coping with new challenges is because our global architecture doesn't reflect the realities of today and isn't fit for purpose. many of the structures that we have to use were set up in 1945. Others have grown since then, but they are not really adapted to a world of such fast-paced, complex challenges, to a world that is so interconnected. And so in the Common Agenda report, the Secretary General mentioned a couple of areas where he feels that our global architecture is particularly lacking. And he would like member states to use the opportunity of the Summit of the Future to change how we do business at the global level. So we do it with more long-term thinking and more future impact in mind, with a more equitable approach, with a better balance in terms of the voices at the table that reflects the power realities of today. And by power realities of today, he means not just the ways in which power amongst member states has changed, but also the power of private actors, for instance, who have so much influence over people's lives and opportunities, but so little accountability at the global level for that influence. Also inclusion of many more voices. So it's very much about changing how we do business so that we do it more effectively for more people and with a view to long-term trends and getting the world onto a better trajectory towards the SDGs.
Thank you, Anis. We have concepts of inclusivity, we have concept of meaningful engagement, right, and long-termism. So I think these are key concepts, and thank you for highlighting them. And zooming in on the structure and the program itself of the Summit of the Future, what are the different tracks the Summit of the Future is built on?
Right, so the Summit will have an intergovernmentally agreed outcome. Member states at this moment are negotiating on a scope for the summit. But the Secretary General has made some proposals in the Common Agenda report and now via a series of policy briefs that deepen the ideas from the Common Agenda report for the issues on which he thinks the summit is an opportunity to make some big decisions. And I'll run through those. We call them tracks, but it doesn't necessarily, each of them doesn't in the end need to be a separate track. The negotiations can be organized in different ways, and that's what member states are discussing now. But these are the proposals that the Secretary General is making. So the first set of proposals is around future generations. And really the ideas there are about how to humanize foresight and long-term thinking. How do we get ourselves to a point where we're making big decisions with full recognition of the future impact of those decisions? And how do we transform the way we live today so that it isn't harming future generations in this foreseeable way that we currently are? There are a lot of ideas in that brief about foresight and better use of data, but also about building on the vast experience at national level. Many countries already have this commitment in their constitutions, and they're already doing this in their parliaments and in other ways. How do we build on all that national practice and put in place at the global level some measures that will allow us to always think about the future impact of our decisions? There's another set of proposals around global shocks. Recognizing, and the COVID and the secondary impacts of Ukraine have really brought this home, that most of the shocks that we face today don't do us the favor of staying within one silo and one sector. COVID is a good example. It rapidly went from being a public health crisis to being a socioeconomic and a human rights and a gender crisis and a political crisis in many places. There is the global governance architecture is not set up to deal with crises like that. Each piece of the architecture has a specific issue that it's responsible for. So the Secretary General is asking for the ability and the right to convene in a meaningful way at a leadership level to ensure that our response to shocks it cuts across all of those sectors and brings to bear the leverage and the resources and the will of many different actors so that we respond better to global shocks in the future. There's another set of proposals around meaningful youth engagement in global decision-making, a promise that we have long made and not kept. How to make that more systematic. Young people, Generation Z, are 30% of the global population. Their digital skills, their intelligence, their energy are amazing, and we need to harness them and include them in new ways to make sure that global governance it takes advantage of all that they have to offer. But we also need to hear them, because they are the ones who are already, never mind future generations, young people alive today, already being badly impacted by the short-termism of our decision-making. So there's another set of, there's two policy briefs. Each policy brief corresponds to a series of proposals that the Secretary General is putting on the table for the summit. So there are two that are about the global economy. One is about how to get beyond GDP as a metric of human progress. And this proposal is not to replace GDP. We recognize absolutely that there is value in GDP, which can be counted across countries, which is a very clear metric for economic goods and services, but it doesn't tell the whole story of human progress. And in fact, perversely, it counts some things like overfishing and deforestation as positives, when in fact we understand that they are really negatives for our climate. So this is a set of proposals about getting to a place where the ways we measure progress take into account sustainability, equality, human well-being, and all of the things that GDP leaves out. And we're proposing a kind of a process to arrive at a methodology that is robust, that all countries can implement and have the capacity to implement, that will tell us a much fuller story about human well-being, planetary well-being, and progress, so that we can actually design our policies and our interventions and our financing with that fuller picture in mind. There's a complementary brief on the international financial architecture, in which the Secretary General is making some proposals for how to do business in terms of financing, debt, tax, how the business model of the multilateral development banks, how the international financial institutions work, drawing on all of the lessons that we've learned from the last couple of years, where we found that the architecture was not able to support countries in the right way, at the right time, on the right issues. So many vulnerable middle-income countries and climate-affected countries were not able to access the kind of support they needed. This is obviously a contribution to a larger conversation that has been going on. We've seen the Paris Summit last week, the Bridgetown Initiative, and like many of the proposals in this Summit of the Future Space, they're not happening in isolation from broader conversations that are happening out there in the real world. And these are the Secretary General's contributions, in the hope that member states will use the summit as an occasion to make big decisions. And he's speaking to member states, not just as UN member states, but as member states of all of these other organizations in global governance, to really at the leadership level think about the tools that they have, the governance architecture they have, and whether it's fit for purpose to deliver for people in a meaningful way, leaving no one behind. There's another set of briefs that cover issues around digital and how all of the ways in which AI and technological developments have redefined our lives. These briefs try to both look at the positive side, how do we harness the benefits, close the digital divide, make sure people have the meaningful connectivity, all of the kind of benefits of technology and digitalization. How do we harness those for the most people and not allow the few to hoard the benefits while most people are left out? But also they look at the negative, the downsides. How do we manage the risks more effectively? What guardrails and norms do we need to make sure that human rights are protected online, and that we foresee, again, any negative impacts of these developments, that we keep human control over lethal weapons, that we foresee all of both the positives and the negatives, and manage them all for the good of humanity. There's a related brief that looks particularly at the information ecosystem, which obviously has changed fundamentally with social media and digitalization. And this brief calls for a code of conduct for responsible public information, for integrity in public information, looking at the role of states and companies and others in hoping to kind of get us to a point where our information ecosystem can be a more responsible one, where human rights are protected. There is a brief also on outer space, which might seem to some people to be, barely relevant if you've got a population that's hungry and doesn't have access to energy sources. But the truth is, there's a lot that's happening in outer space that is meaningful for all of humanity. Only 20 or so countries right now have the capabilities to be up there, along with commercial actors who are not accountable at all. But the benefits of space assets, the information that space technologies and satellites can give us on navigation, on climate change, on a host of things. 40% of the SDGs goals and targets are actually reliant on data from space. So again, how do we harness the benefits of space exploration for all of humanity and minimize the risks of militarization and competition up in space, and put in place the right guardrails for that? Another brief that's coming shortly is on a new agenda for peace, which similarly looks at the whole peace and security landscape. It looks at all of the changes that are occurring to the nature of conflict, the nature of competition, the weaponization of new domains, but also our failure to solve long-standing problems of conflict and vulnerability, and it looks at our toolbox and our collective security machinery and tries to make proposals for how those can both be reformed to better reflect the realities of today and adapted to reflect these new developments. And then finally, we will have policy briefs on education, which look at the role of education as a global public good, and on UN 2.0, which really is about the things that the Secretary General can do in his own authority to match what he's asking member states to do at the summit and to bring the UN system along into the 21st century and beyond through better use of foresight and data and behavioral science and many other things. So all of these briefs contain proposals to member states for deliberation and consideration at the Summit of the Future. Some have a lot that we would like member states to consider deciding. Some are a little bit more for information, but they're part of this vision of global governance that delivers more effectively and in a way that has more equitable outcomes for more people.
Thank you. Very ambitious agenda, but it's exactly what we need. And building up on the last point on member states, how can member states give their meaningful contribution throughout the summit?
So I think we're really at a critical point in the preparations for the summit. Member states right now are deciding on the summit scope. They're taking into account all of these ideas from the Secretary General, but they're also taking into account their own priorities and their own vision for what the summit would achieve. I think what we really hope right now is that the member states that feel passionate and committed to the ideas that are on the table should create cross-regional coalitions, champion these ideas, push for them. I think this is a complex set of proposals. We're asking some member states to share some power, to allow some more seats to pull up at the table, to share the benefits more broadly. So there are a lot of countries that we're saying, some of this might be against your interests in certain ways because you are beneficiaries of the current system, but everyone will benefit from an international cooperation architecture that is more effective. And the kinds of crises that are coming at us, climate change being the best example, they're going to affect everybody in every country, no matter how powerful. Borders will be meaningless. Even levels of economic advancement might be meaningless in the face of some of these crises. So we hope that member states will have the kind of vision to commit to a series of changes to our architecture, even if they don't love every idea in the package. They will love some of these ideas, and we really need everybody to see that the big picture is about the changes that we all need.
Thank you. And speaking about ideas that we love, I personally love the idea of future generations. You mentioned it as very first element in the program of the summit. And you mentioned how nowadays we do have foresight tools to predict the implications of our actions and our choices for future generations, but yet we're not able to deliver on these promises, and we somehow seem to be stuck in short-termism. So what do you think can be a key for us to really push forward the long-termism as paramount for future generations to come?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. And I mean, it's not by accident that we called this the Summit of the Future, because that is one of the most fundamental parts of this whole effort, is to say the way we do business, we cannot continue. And how are we going to look our grandchildren in the eye? How will future generations forgive us for having continued on this path? The proposals in the Common Agenda report and in the related policy brief are actually quite modest for putting in place some early, just small steps to help us develop the habit of thinking about the future when we make big decisions. These are things that many countries have already done at the national level. There's a lot of practice on which to build. It's also a promise that we made in the opening lines of the UN Charter to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The Common Agenda report points out that if we were to write that charter today, the list of scourges from which we would need to save succeeding generations is much longer. And shame on us for that fact. So how do we keep that promise? It's been made in countless international agreements, including Agenda 2030, including the Paris Agreement. It's been made in more than 400 General Assembly resolutions, but we don't yet have the mechanisms to actually make it a reality. That to me, my heart is also, it's one of the closest sets of proposals to my heart, because I think it has the value not only, hopefully, of changing how we do business, but also, and this is a very important aspect of the summit to understand as well, the symbolic value of signaling to people that we are changing. Because I think any of the specific proposals for the summit are one thing, and they're all very important on their own merits, but big picture, maybe the biggest value of all of this summit is that it should, I hope, send to people all around the world a message that global governance is working for them. It has their interests in mind. It's the benefits are not just hoarded for the few. The system isn't rigged against them. The system is working for them. And so, again, back to the central messages of the Common Agenda report, in the end, it's as much about restoring trust, people's trust in each other, people's trust in their governments, and in people's trust in the institutions of global governance, and trust between countries that they can work together, they can find common ground, even if they disagree on some things. And so if we can wake up the day after the summit and everybody has more confidence and trust in global governance, I think that alone will have been a kind of a major achievement. And to me, making a promise to future generations and then finally putting in place practical ways to keep that promise is a huge part of beginning to restore that trust. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not something that's going to happen in one summit. This is a long process of rebuilding and restoring and reinvigorating. But I do believe that the summit is a major milestone on that road.
Thank you. And it's all about being good ancestors after all. No?
Exactly.
They can look at us.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And also going back to the core of sustainable development and the definition of it.
Exactly, no? From the Brundtland Commission.
Exactly.
Precisely.
Development matches the needs of current generations without compromising the ones of future ones.
Precisely. Yes, we were that's very inspired by that definition of sustainable development, which again, we have never really put into practice.
Yeah. Michelle, we're unfortunately almost at the end of our conversations, and I would like to conclude with a question that I guess you partially already answered to. But what would success be for you? What would a successful summit be for you? And what is the legacy that you're hoping the summit will bring forward?
Right, so very good question. I mean, I think obviously, as I said, first and foremost, if we all wake up the day after the summit feeling much more confidence and faith and trust and solidarity, I think in the short term, again, the day after the summit, hopefully it will have produced some meaningful changes and meaningful commitments to the how, so that we can deliver the what. But it can't be the end of the road. And in many cases, with many of the tracks that I mentioned that the Secretary General has proposed, the summit is not going to solve every issue, and it's not going to be the end of the story. It needs to be a direction of travel towards a better future. It needs to have put us, kind of irreparably on a path towards a better future for everybody. And it needs to be a conversation that isn't just member states sitting in New York, but a global conversation that people all around the world feel part of, and they see how they can contribute as well as benefit. And I think it's in Geneva and in every other corner of the world, something that people feel they ownership over. It is our common agenda. It is our future. They're our sustainable development goals. And I think that that needs to be felt deeply by every person, that they're part of international cooperation isn't something that happens somewhere else in a dusty meeting room. It's something everybody's contributing to all the time. And if the summit can really make people feel that way and give us a clear road to follow, to get towards the SDGs and to deal with all these new threats and challenges in a meaningful way that delivers for future generations and present generations, because those things are not competing with each other, then I think that would be success.
We are all in this together at the end,
indeed,
right?
we are. Indeed, we are.
Michelle, thank you very much. What else to add rather than your beautiful word and sharing really your hopes and wishes for this summit? Maybe a summit where key conversations are really brought to the table and acted upon with meaningful efforts and commitments. And personally, may it also be a summit where future generations as well as younger generations are really at the forefront of our conversations, not just as receivers of today's words, but really as designers and torchbearers of tomorrow's world.
Absolutely, and if they can look back and say that was the moment when we changed course,
We succeeded.
that was the moment the world heard the wake-up call in the Common Agenda and set course for the SDGs, then I think we really will have done right.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Michelle.
Thank you so much.